Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 2, Episode 5, Charades. We start out with Nurse Chapel's personal log. The crew of the Enterprise are going to be surveying some moon where an ancient civilization once lived and then vanished. They are traveling toward Vulcan because apparently that's where the moon was, that apparently the Vulcans have never fully explored. Okie dokie then. They are traveling at sub-impulse speed, so the crew can get some downtime. Nurse Chapel is using her downtime to prepare for an interview for a fellowship with the Vulcan Science Academy. Everyone is helping her prepare, with the exception of Spock. He seems to be avoiding Nurse Chapel. Spock is getting help from Dr. M'Benga to better control his emotions, because a Vulcan will need help from a human doctor to do that. Spock is learning to cook under Captain Pike's expert tutelage. Spock states that he can't smell the herbs Pike has grown due to the nasal suppressant Spock uses in order to tolerate being in such close proximity to smelly humans. Which I also thought was a weakness in Enterprise, as in the Scott Bakula series. But hey, whatever. T-Pring's mother is insisting on having the traditional Vulcan engagement dinner when Spock arrives on Vulcan. T-Pring's mother doesn't approve of the engagement. Spock has to pilot the shuttle, investigating the moon, ancient civilization, and some energy anomaly above the moon, and Nurse Chapel is his passenger. And it is awkward. Their scans indicate that the energy anomaly is a stable vortex or a rupture in space-time. The concept kind of reminded me of the wormhole aliens in Deep Space Nine or the ascended beings in Stargate. Somehow, Spock crashes the shuttle. He was injured in the crash, but the vortex aliens have repaired the shuttle and Spock, only they didn't get Spock right. The aliens removed Spock's Vulcan genes and made him fully human. When Spock wakes up and learns what happened, he responds, "What the fa?" The aliens left behind a calling card, so Pike has Uhura call them. But the aliens appear to be energy-based with computer-generated voices. It was like talking to Siri or Alexa. The alien's name is Yellow, the one that he is speaking with, and Yellow tells Pike that Spock had mixed instructions, so they made him match Nurse Chapel, and remediation was made. Pike fails to explain the situation, and Yellow signs off, leaving the Enterprise unable to get back in touch. Throughout the rest of the episode, Nurse Chapel is trying to find a cure for Spock. Spock is behaving like a human teenager and has fully human emotions. Nurse Chapel has a disastrous interview with the Vulcan Science Academy, and Spock has to fake his way through the engagement dinner with T-Pring and her parents. When Spock's mother Amanda comes on board the Enterprise, Spock is wearing a winter hat to cover his human ears, while the actress playing Amanda is wearing a dress that is so tight on her cleavage that her breasts appear to be deformed. She figures out what's going on, and she helps Spock prepare to fake his way through the engagement ceremonies. When T-Pring comes aboard, Spock chooses not to tell her what's going on. T-Pring's mother is a real ballbuster, and T-Pring's father needs to retrieve his balls from her handbag. Pike made a bunch of ceremonial food because he's now the cook for the ship for the dinner, which T-Pring's father likes until his horrible wife makes some critical remarks about the food, and all of a sudden it is incredibly distasteful, and T-Pring's father doesn't eat it. While the dinner is in progress, Uhura, Ortegas, and Chapel head to the vortex, and beg the aliens for help fixing Spock. Chapel has to admit to the aliens that she has feelings for Spock, but she'll only admit this after Ortegas and Uhura face the other way. During the ceremony, T-Pring's mother says some horrible things to Spock about him being a huge disappointment. In the final portion of the ceremony, Spock must mind meld with his mother in order to view a memory from his childhood. Spock, Pike, and Amanda are trying to stall in the hopes that Nurse Chapel finds a cure for fully human Spock. Pike suggests playing charades is a traditional human engagement custom, and it's as cringy as it sounds. Nurse Chapel shows up with the cure and administers it to Spock. Spock goes through with the mind meld and says it was just an ordinary day from his childhood. At the end of the ceremonies, T-Pring's mother says something rude about Spock making it through the ceremony despite his handicap, meaning his human mother. And Spock pulls off his fake ears and reveals that he got through the ritual as a full human. He goes on to say that his mother is the most compassionate, resilient, and tolerant person he's ever known, and his mother possesses true strength, putting up with all the mistreatment she's suffered from Vulcans. T-Pring isn't happy Spock didn't tell her what was going on. He involved pretty much everyone on the ship, but didn't feel comfortable telling her, and asks, "How am I meant to feel knowing that you did not trust me?" Then she says it would be best if they took some time apart and leaves. When Amanda is leaving, Spock asks why she chose that memory to share with him. His mother tells him that she chose that memory because it was the first time Vulcan children had asked Spock to play, and that was the first time Spock felt accepted. Spock confesses that he was so focused on his own journey that he never realized how tough his mother had it on Vulcan. She tells him it is not easy being a human who loves a Vulcan. We next see Spock in his quarters, and as the doors open for him to go see Nurse Chapel, she happens to be standing right in front of him, so he doesn't have to go far. He tells her that he and T-Pring are on a break, and he has feelings for someone else. They kiss. He asks, "What does this mean?" She says, "I don't know. Shut up." And the screen goes black as they're kissing. I don't know. I mean, I might have to call this the worst episode of Strange New Worlds. They've been on a roll, unfortunately, lately, with some not-so-horrible episodes. The previous episode, the retelling of the Lotus Eaters from Homer's Odyssey, that wasn't too bad. But this took character assassination to a whole new level. First thing I want to point out is, it's a good thing this is a different timeline, because if this was the real history of Spock and Nurse Chapel in TOS, then Spock is a huge schmuck, and poor Nurse Chapel is pathetic, chasing after him long after their affair is over. It was just so ridiculous. If you tried to put this into the original series timeline, this is just horrifying.
This episode was aiming at a very young audience. This was an episode aimed at the CW audience. I know sometimes the joke we make when we don't like something or we're just saying it's done so immaturely is to say, oh, it's kind of CW-y. No, this actually could have been on the CW.
Well, would it surprise you to learn that the writers on this, the first one, Henry Alonzo Myers, he wrote that Spock Amok from season 1, where Spock and T-Pring accidentally changed places in a Freaky Friday kind of event. He also wrote the first episode of this season along with Akiva Goldsman. He has a history of writing going back to the original iteration of Charmed, but the portion of it that took place in the early 2000s. And then the other person who wrote on this, Catherine Lynn, she prolifically wrote for Lower Decks.
I know some of our audience sometimes defends Lower Decks, but I never liked it. It always seemed to me like all it was callbacks. All it was member berries. Yeah, they got a lot of the member berries correct, but all it is callbacks. Just recycling, moving furniture around in a room and saying, I've redecorated.
It feels to me like a lot of this writing lately, not just on Star Trek, but in general, has been taking established franchises and characters and, like you just said, rearranging the chairs and pretending it's something new. It's like they took these characters and said, what if? And inserted a ridiculous situation and then wrote that. And it's just a complete bastardization of what came before.
This episode, to me, and I don't know who's going to get this reference, but this episode's main storyline, it reminded me of an episode of The Munsters from the 60s when Herman Munster got struck by lightning and he turned into a human being. And the family had to deal with him being a human being, and Herman Munster had to deal with him being a human being. I'm not saying they stole from the Munsters. I'm just saying that's what this reminded me of, was that episode of The Munsters. This episode was horrible. This was an episode whose entire point was to character assassinate Spock. I've seen some people try to mitigate the criticism of this episode by saying, relax, man, this was just a comedic episode. but it wasn't funny. There was nothing funny here. And when Molly and I were watching this episode and Captain Pike was essentially chefing around, that was his whole role, we made the joke, Captain Pike was Isaac on the old Love Boat. Even at the end there, he made like he snapped his fingers and pointed, just like Isaac did on the Love Boat. I have no words to describe how bad this episode was. This first episode of the season, the same gentleman wrote that as well, right?
Along with Akiva Goldsman, yeah.
It was bad. I'm not going to defend that episode, but I think this was worse because as bad as the first episode was of this season, at least it was aiming at like a later teenager, maybe 16, 18 years old. This episode, and I'm not exaggerating, this is probably aiming for a 12-year-old, maybe a 14 if you're pushing it. That's the emotional development that they were aiming for here. This was really bad. It wasn't a comedic episode. It insulted my intelligence, and what they were doing was ridiculous. I even hate to critique this on a Star Trek level, but at the beginning of the episode, they claimed they were traveling at sub-impulse in order to give them time to do something. I'm not sure I understand what that means. I thought starships had 3 modes of propulsion. They had the warp drive, which was their faster-than-light drive. They had their impulse system, which was not faster than light. And then you had like maneuvering thrusters, like when you were in space dock and you were trying to line up things. So if they weren't going at warp and they were going sub-impulse, does that mean they were going on maneuvering thrusters? And maneuvering thrusters would take thousands of years to travel even any useful distance.
Well, they just threw it in neutral.
That's essentially what using maneuvering thrusters are. They didn't say maneuvering thrusters, but if something is sub-impulse, what does that mean? I mean, I know you could say something like quarter impulse, half impulse, 3/4 impulse, but that's not what they said. They said sub-impulse.
A body in motion tends to stay in motion, especially in a vacuum. So they just threw it in neutral and just rode the wave.
Yeah, I didn't understand that. I'm using Star Trek logic on this television show, and this is not Star Trek. They finally admitted that this was in a separate continuity, but they were still trying to pretend it was Star Trek. This episode wasn't even trying to really pretend it was Star Trek. I don't know what this was. It reminded me, like back in the 90s, like some Nickelodeon thing or something. It was aiming at a really young audience. I almost expected fart jokes and stuff to be kicked in here.
I question, and I'm sure somebody will correct me on this, I just remember back with the Tuvix episode from Voyager. I don't know, why didn't they just, run Spock through the transporter with one of his most recent pattern and just, make new Spock? Because they were talking about running out of time and his genes were going to be solidified like this and they wouldn't be able to change him anymore. And it's like, but I thought every time they went through the transporter, especially after what happened with that last season of Picard, where they were adding genes to people using the transporter system. Again, I'm not saying this logically makes sense with the original timeline. I'm just saying within New Trek, they've already done something that screwed with people's genes using the transporter. Couldn't they have used that to solve his problem?
I guess they would argue that was later in their timeline. I don't know.
But it's a transporter.
Well, agreed. I didn't understand this whole story, and then somehow the change was going to be irreversible after a certain amount of time, and I'm just scratching my head at that. And then you compared this to the anomaly that these entities were in, to like Deep Space Nine's wormhole, and I agree with that. To me, they didn't so much sound like Siri. What these entities sounded like is like they were calling customer service, like a call center or something. Because they would talk about, well, remediation took place. You did not complain within the allotted time period, so blah, 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 blah. It was like they were talking with a call center.
Well, it was like arguing with customer service AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that was supposed to be funny, but it wasn't. Because I remember in the 90s, there was an episode of Sequest DSV where the air conditioning broke down. They needed a part. And so they called in to Central Supply. And the joke there is, this was well before any of the modern call centers, but they were dealing with the equivalent of a call center where they were getting the runaround. They were not given any dates on when they might get their piece. And that actually was funny. This was not. And these entities were called colors. Like we're watching some episode of Sesame Street or something. Hi, I'm yellow. Or no, they were talking to blue and they wanted to go back to yellow because they talked to yellow initially. So they were just colors. Like, again, we're talking Sesame Street type stuff. And I'm not using that just out of the blue. This episode felt that low where it was aiming for, like, what age would actually enjoy this and find it remotely funny. An adult would not even find this comedic. It was just bad.
Well, I'm trying to remember. Wasn't there a show or a movie or something where there were agents and they were like Mr. Brown or Mr. Green, Mr. White?
That was a movie. I thought that was Reservoir Dogs. Where
I think you're right.
They didn't know anybody's name. They just had code colors.
Yes, you're right. There was. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, it comes back to, for some reason, they can't do anything that's original. I don't think that this is how our parents felt when they were our age. Like, they had seen enough that they could pick stuff out and say, well, this was from this was from that. And a lot of people, I'm sure, will say, well, it's just common tropes kind of stuff. And it's like, no. When you can take and break something down to all of its components and every single one came from someplace else, where's the creativity in that? Again, this goes back to what I've been saying. It feels like this is written by AI. It really does. Like, they took these ideas from other franchises that they thought were good. They fed it into a database, and the AI used that to spit out a story.
And the whole Vulcan ceremony that was being done here was contrived and stupid. The father-in-law, he expressed emotions. The whole concept here was the mother-in-law, the soon-to-be mother-in-law, was very staunch in her Vulcan beliefs, and she was big into ceremony and following old Vulcan ways. So Spock not being Vulcan at all anymore, he was going to struggle to even approach anything close to what would be acceptable. But then this lady's husband, the father-in-law, when he took that pike dish, whatever the heck that was at the beginning.
It looked like some sort of cupcake.
At first, he was like all excited. You could see excitement in his face and you could hear it in his voice.
Mm-hmm.
So he was displaying emotion. Shouldn't that lady have gotten on his case for showing emotion like that?
Well, and then at the end, when T-Pring asks how she's supposed to feel that Spock didn't feel comfortable coming to her and telling her what was going on. Again, this is the story of the USS Feelings.
Well, that concept in Star Trek 3 leading into Star Trek 4. And the question was asked as Spock was being retrained. The last question was, how do you feel? And Spock didn't understand the question. So why would T-Pring even use that if a Vulcan doesn't understand that concept, which was established in the Voyage Home, Star Trek 4, that Spock did not understand how do you feel until the very end of the film, where he basically rediscovered his human side. How was T-Pring supposed to know that?
They don't know how to write Vulcans on this show. Or actually in any new Trek. They just don't.
They write them just like they're irked off people. They're just angry people. Yeah, jerky people.
Yeah.
Because there's even a sense of like disgust with a little bit of anger mixed in there.
And arrogance.
Well, yeah, Vulcans I think have an arrogant quality anyway, but...
True, but this is worse than just being arrogant.
They're showing off their arrogance.
Something more than that. There's actually, it seems like hatred.
Yeah, that's what there's like an anger, almost there's something there that's not Vulcan. They should be passionless people.
Yeah.
Where a human being might see that passion lacking as some sort of problem or an intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how you're supposed to portray a Vulcan, is they're not angry, they're just indifferent because they're doing their thing.
Mm-hmm.
This episode, I cannot explain in words how bad this episode was. This episode was another hour episode, just like Ace Ventura and Discount Drummer's episode with the hot dog a couple of episodes ago. And this episode, much like that episode did a character assassination on Captain Kirk. This episode did a character assassination on Spock.
Oh, and don't forget, Sam Kirk was getting it from Spock in this one for leaving crumbs all over the boardroom table or conference room table.
Yeah, like some OCD moment or something.
To the point where security had to hold Spock back because he was trying to attack Sam Kirk for being a slob.
It was supposed to be funny that Spock was like, you pick that stuff up, you pick it up. That was supposed to be funny. All it was cringe. Anything that somebody might claim was funny wasn't funny. It's that cringe where you just have that, your mouth gritted the whole time, one after another when they try to make jokes and it doesn't land. And there's like a shared embarrassment that kicks in because I feel bad that somebody even tried to do something like that and they failed so miserably.
This seems to be nothing but personal journeys, and I think that's why each episode starts out with a personal log instead of just the captain's log.
I don't think we're going to get an actual Star Trek episode this season. Anything like remotely approximating it. Mm-mm. Like last week's, half of it was sort of Star Trek. We gave it credit for that. I cannot see how this series continues. I know they were greenlit for a third season, but with the writer's strike, I don't know if any of season 3 was filmed. They should just put everything in the garbage for season 3. This is getting worse. This episode, if somebody told me it was an episode of Star Trek Discovery, I would believe them. That's how bad this episode was. It didn't have like the overly woke stuff in there like Discovery has, but it was bad. It was nonsensical. It was juvenile. I was embarrassed watching it because I thought I was watching a show for kids. That's why we don't review Star Trek Prodigy. We decided that was aimed at children, and we didn't feel comfortable critiquing a show aimed for children. So that's why we don't do Star Trek Prodigy. But this episode was supposed to be geared for adults. This was supposed to be the series that was going to win old school fans back.
I don't see how.
After this episode, I don't see how either. This was insulting. This reminded me of Star Trek Discovery because it's been a while since Star Trek Discovery's been on the air in quotation marks. But we've got that new season coming up, the last season. And one has to remember, Star Trek Discovery is its own set of stupidity and garbage. And yes, this lacked the woke, overt in your face. But the stupidity was just as stupid as any Star Trek Discovery episode. People who are saying this series is better than Star Trek Discovery, I've argued before this episode that's not true. And after this episode, really? Do you really think it's any better than Star Trek Discovery?
The only reason this is any better than Discovery is because they're not going around committing war crime after war crime after war crime.
Good point.
On this show.
Good point.
That's it. Because otherwise, and there's no Stacey Abrams on this either.
Not yet.
But
she'll probably travel back in time from Discovery and, yeah, I am the president of the future. Vote for me.
Yeah, I do not want modern politics dragged into my shows like that, especially when it appears to be some sort of campaign ad for somebody who's running for office. That's not right.
We said that in our review of that episode.
Yeah.
Because that episode, I believe, was the one when they were trying to communicate with those cloud creatures.
Yes.
And they were using lights to communicate. These entities in that wormhole in this episode reminded me a little bit of those, like they were recycling that idea.
Yeah, because they had the light up stuff, which again, that idea was similar to, the hell was that movie called?
Close Encounters.
Yes, Close Encounters.
Of the Third Kind.
Yeah. So, there's nothing new in this show. They write the stories around the characters to create situations and evoke emotions that they want you to feel. So, the story is secondary to the rest of that crap.
Nurse Chapel and Dr. Mbanga, they fist bumped. I do not understand why anybody would like this series. I just don't. And then there were scenes where they were in, I guess it was, I don't know, it wasn't a cafeteria, but like a bunch of the people were getting together and telling jokes and stuff. And the point was before Spock transformed, he sat there politely, but he didn't understand the humor or anything. But then after he transformed, he was like laughing at the table to the point where he was almost obnoxious.
Yeah.
It was cringy. Like everything about this was cringy. Then you had Ortegas trying to teach Spock how to be a Vulcan.
Ugh.
And what they were doing was making fun of him, trying to say, well, you have to talk like this, and then you have to do this, because I think it was Ortegas, Una, and Discount Drummer were trying to teach Spock how to be Spock after he turned human. But what they were doing was just making fun of him. Because I think Spock even said, really, I sound like that? They were just making fun of him. This whole episode was just making fun of Spock.
For all the issues that Tuvix episode had back with Voyager, it had better philosophical discussion than this episode did.
That episode of the Munsters where Herman Munster got struck by lightning had more philosophical meaning to it than this. And I'm not joking.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's the freaking Munsters. There is no recommendation here, even to watch this for poking fun at it. It's so cringy, you'd be wasting your time because all you'd be doing the entire hour is just putting your hand over your face as a face palm. There's really no point in watching this other than if you really want to punish yourself for an hour, maybe you feel guilty about getting off a diet or treating somebody badly today and you want to punish yourself, I guess watch this for an hour and you'll feel like you've properly been punished for any misdeeds you did. Unless you're like 11, 12 years old, you're not going to get anything from this episode. Even if you pretend it's a completely different series, franchise, it's not even Star Trek, it's just comedy in space. You'd have to be really, really young to get anything out of this. So anybody who's saying this is comedic, I question the emotional development of these people because it's not.
Well, when Nurse Chapel told Uhura and Ortegas to turn around so she could discuss her feelings for Spock with the wormhole aliens, that was seriously cringy. That was the kind of behavior you would see from a middle schooler. That was certainly not the way a mature adult deals with their feelings. For being the USS Feelings, they don't even do it right.
This was a bad episode. This was, I think, the worst episode of Strange New Worlds. And it's up there with some of the worst Star Trek Discovery episodes.
Yeah, this was really bad. As I said, I do believe this was probably the worst episode of this series. And I don't know why they thought this was a good idea.
I don't think there's a probably. What would be worse?
I am not looking forward to seeing where this relationship goes. I am just not. I cringe when I think about it. It's that shared embarrassment thing. I don't like it. It makes me very uncomfortable.
As you pointed out, the segment before the introductory credits, when Spock got transformed, and it was pointed out to him that he was human, and they cut him off, he was going to say the F word. Spock was going to say the F word. That's where Star Trek is right now. Then they were making these suggestions that Spock, because he's been transformed, he's like going through a second puberty, because he was talking to Discount Drummer, because after he tried to start that fight with George Kirk for making a mess on the floor, then he was talking to Discount Drummer because she's head of security, so I guess she went in to talk to him after he was confined. And he was talking like a teenage boy, and they were saying stuff like, well, sexual urges and I'm hungry all the time, like when you're a kid growing up. You eat when you're a teenager, not because you're a teenager, but your body's growing. You need those nutrients. It made no sense for Spock to be shoving his face like that. He's a fully grown man. And then there was this awkward moment where he was almost sexually making some sort of advances to Discount Drummer, and there was an awkward situation there. Like a teenage boy.
That was like back when I was young and the boys would all have to walk around with their trapper keepers in front of them in school because things just weren't under control.
That's about what this was. Yeah,
that's what it felt like. That's what it seemed to me. They were trying to emulate that. And it was embarrassing. It was very embarrassing.
There was no need to do this. Even in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, when that husk of Spock was growing, he didn't behave as juvenile as Ethan Peck Spock did in this episode. This was horrible. Spock's mother-in-law, I was making the joke because we have Discount Drummer, just her general look, what is she, Discount Avasarala? Because she even kind of acted like her a little bit, except Avasarala is a cool character, and this lady was not.
Avasarala was actually a nicer person, and that's saying something, because she was a hard ass.
This was just bad, and then Pike was cooking again. I think every episode this season he was cooking at some point, and I get it's a hobby of his. I understand that. But that's what he's doing this season. All he does is cook. That's it. He cooks.
He's Captain Cook. Now, that would be a better show.
So I don't understand why, because in Star Trek, The Undiscovered Country, they had like a galley with people preparing food and stuff. They showed that. So why is Pike the only one on that ship that can make food?
Why does he have a gourmet kitchen in his quarters?
Yeah, his gigantic quarters that's in some ways bigger than where we live.
Yes, it is. It's bigger than our whole apartment.
I could go down the line here of just all the things that are wrong with this show, but there's no reason to. This episode really explains to me whatever positives I was trying to see the last 3 episodes. I was really trying to find something that they were trying to do right. They're not serious about making Star Trek. This was not a comedic episode. Some people would say, oh, this is kind of like the Naked Now from the older Star Treks, where they just kind of have a disease and then they kind of have jokey, funny stuff. But this wasn't that. This was below that level of humor. And by level of humor, when Data and Tasha did it, and this was below that sort of humor, what am I saying? That bar was kind of low anyway, and this went well below that. Because at the end of the episode, the implication is after they were kissing and she told him to shut up and let's just keep going, I'm pretty sure the implication there is that they did it, Data and Tasha style.
That's what I inferred from that, was that they were going to do it. Yeah. See, my question is, okay, so if it's not during the Ponfar, does that mean Spock is infertile?
I don't think they ever covered that, so I don't know. I think the massive desire for reproduction only happens then, but yeah, do Vulcans
shoot blanks?
Yeah, when they're not in that. I don't know if, maybe somebody in our comments can answer. Well, I even hate to ask that because that's such a bizarre question.
Maybe it's only the females drop an egg every 7 years.
I don't know. I don't think they've ever covered that. Honestly, I never spent any time thinking about that. But I'm sure well, never mind.
But again, that's the kind of question this kind of crap brings up, which tells you the quality of this show.
Well, I'm waiting for Nurse Chapel to be pregnant.
Yeah.
Because, sure, why not? We'll line that up with TOS, no freaking problem.
Spock's baby.
Yeah, Spock's. That would be like the episode name, Spock's baby. But they'll go to that cloud where Dr. Mbenga's daughter is, and then they'll just chuck Spock's baby in that cloud, just like they did with Dr. Mbenga's daughter, so no big deal. This show is just so ridiculous. Anson Mount, who I actually think would have the range to play this captain well if he was allowed to be the lead or a lead on the show, but they just make a joke of him.
Well, we're not allowed to have any alpha males.
Well, that's the joke, too, is whenever I look on the bridge, because this show is problematic, because you have Anson Mount and you have Ethan Peck, Pike and Spock. So, because you have those 2 white males on the bridge, when you look behind them, they do their best to put as much diversity behind them as they can. It's almost always a woman. usually a white woman, but sometimes they mix it up a little bit. And I imagine the people writing this really have a problem. They're like, damn it, Spock and Pike are in this scene. Now what are we going to do?
And that's the other thing. I think that a lot of people don't understand that alpha male is actually an anthropological thing. Like, not just in humans, but, like, think about that Alpha and Omega movie with the wolves, if people have seen that. It's a cartoon, so I don't know if our listeners are the right age group to have seen that. But the whole thing about the alpha is it's the leader. It's the top wolf.
Yeah, in the comments a few weeks ago, you had somebody saying, well, I liked your video, but when you threw the word beta out, it just took me out of it. But beta is an actual classification, as is alpha. There's also gamma people as well.
Yeah.
Those are things. That's not just we're fighting a culture war on our YouTube channel.
No.
Those are actually defined. The captain has to be an alpha.
Yes.
If the captain's not an alpha, the captain's not a captain.
That is correct. The leader must be an alpha. That's the definition of being the leader. Yeah, betas are followers, and gammas are, for lack of a better word, simps. A lot of these words have real meanings, but they've been weaponized. Like, toxic masculinity is a real thing. Toxic femininity is a real thing. Usually, with toxic femininity, it's not that they're acting like men, it's that they are toxically feminine to the point where they're acting helpless. That is usually toxic femininity. I've seen these terms just being thrown around in a political way, and it's taking the real definition of these terms and it's robbing them of any strength whatsoever. I mean, we're not even allowed to utter the term beta male anymore without being accused of being political, when this is actually a real thing. Same with toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. These are real things, but they've been weaponized. So we can't even talk about them anymore, and it's horrible.
Pike is not an alpha.
No.
I don't know who he would defer to. It probably changes week to week.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not an alpha, which is too bad because the way he walks and he gives you the outward appearance that that's an alpha male, but the character Pike is not an alpha male.
He has the desired physique of an alpha male. The powerful, tall, well-built male body. But unfortunately, they are writing him as a beta male because we're not allowed to have alpha males right now. I don't know if it's too threatening or what the real problem is, but you're not allowed to have that.
Because the ship, this Enterprise, seems to be run by committee. Captain Pike doesn't run the ship. It's a committee of, I guess, his officers that decide what they're going to do or how they're going to do it.
Just look at that first episode when Pike wasn't there. And by committee, I guess they decided that they were going to go to that planet where La'an was calling for help.
People who say this is so different than Star Trek Discovery, which, by the way, Star Trek Discovery, they have written Michael Burnham to be an alpha. So they've given her the alpha qualities. But that's, as far as captaining, that's it as far as what I see on this ship. Everybody else is like a beta. I guess Tilly kind of has moments where she's an alpha, and that Jet Reno has moments where she's an alpha. But like Dr. Culber, except for that one time he stood up to Saru, Dr. Culber refused to torture the tardigrade. Usually Dr. Culber is somewhere between an alpha and a beta.
Oh, I was going to say a beta and a gamma.
You think so? Okay.
Usually, yeah. Yeah, because Stamets is occasionally an alpha, but oftentimes he's a beta. That would be his partner on the show, or husband, I guess they're married. His husband on the show.
And you look at this Enterprise crew, Discount Drummer's an alpha, Una's an alpha, Ortegas wants to be an alpha, so I guess we'll give her that. Is Spock an alpha?
Oh, God, no.
In this episode, he definitely wasn't. But before this, I don't think so. Captain Pike's not an alpha. This is just really weird. I mean, I'm not trying to get into some sort of cultural discussion here, but we're kind of into it a little bit. But I don't know how you can have a Star Trek show with a captain. And it doesn't have to be male. Captain Janeway was an alpha.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't have, it's not, I just want the males to be alpha. No, what I'm saying is people in leadership roles, leadership is alpha.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not an alpha, you're probably not going to be a leader. You might be somebody who facilitates the alpha. I don't think we need true alphas. If we had true alphas on a ship fighting it out for control.
Well, that would be TOS Con.
Right. Because you fall into regulations is why you don't try to take over a starship. But if you're in an officer leadership command role, you should have, if not an alpha, you should have alpha qualities. Because you're in command.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going down the command path, you have to be an alpha. You have to make decisions. People look to you to lead. That's what leaders are. And this show, Captain Pike is not an alpha most times. I mean, occasionally they'll dabble with playing with him as an alpha, but most of the times, I remember in Discovery, people were so fooled by him. Oh, it's finally nice to see an alpha captain that's not Michael Burnham on Discovery. But then when Pike would make a assertion about something, then Michael Burnham would have to establish dominance, and she would get him to agree that what she was saying was right, so he would defer to her. So he was a beta definitely around Michael Burnham. I realize this is off topic. It's just Pike being the chef all season. This is getting ridiculous. And then him actually making hand gestures, so I'm actually thinking he's Isaac from The Love Boat. So now he is because I think Isaac was a bartender, if I'm remembering The Love Boat from the 70s correctly. Okay, the captain of the starship is Isaac from The Love Boat.
And he made all the food for the party, for that engagement dinner. That was just weird. Very weird.
And then when they were stalling for time, he was the one that came up with we have an Earth tradition, and they were playing charades, or they were going to play charades.
Yeah.
That's the name of the episode and why it was named that. I'm surprised they didn't whip the old Pictionary out or something and play that.
Well, plus the whole thing was a charade. Spock pretending to be Vulcan.
Agreed.
That's really what it was. So, I mean, they got kind of stupidly meta, but it was stupid.
This just was bad. I guess that I'm done with the culture war commentary, but this established to me, this episode, that Captain Pike is not an alpha. On his own ship, he's not even an alpha. Yes, you could say he volunteered to cook for that ceremony, but there was nobody else on that ship. They don't have a galley like they did in Star Trek VI. Captain Pike really was the best to make dishes because he played around with the Vulcan dishes. Really? Because it didn't seem the Vulcans were too happy with what he made anyway. So after seeing yet another episode of Captain Pike cooking, I just had to bring up that this guy is a beta male. And no, just because you cook doesn't make you a beta. But when you defer your command roles to cook, and that's it, he shouldn't have even been in that whole ceremony to begin with. He was just functioning as I don't know, not quite as bad as a cocktail waitress, but he was close to that.
He was Isaac from The Love Boat.
Isaac from The Love Boat.
Yeah. Well, I could keep going, but I'm going to let it go there. Anybody else? Did you have the misfortune of watching this episode? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Take care.